living up to the promise of a free press, and they were disappointed. It was a period of profound political change, military plots and actual coup attempts to take over government, the restoration of the judiciary, the drafting of a new constitution. Many felt that journalists needed to move from the daily grind of crime, disaster, and press conferences, celebrity events, even from the fixed government beats, and instead deep dive beneath the surface of the news with more in-depth and at length journalism. CMFR first gave awards for the best investigative reports, ranking the top three. As the program gained following, the articles showed the application of journalistic investigation, tracking the paper or the money trail, engaging in lengthy interviews, and observing closely the scene in order to identify the principal actors and how they work together, corroborating evidence from various sources in order to verify truth. Investigative journalism reveals or exposes what may be kept secret, shining light on the truth hidden from the public eye. It is a form of journalism that deeply disturbs the comfort of those taking advantage of the power of their position. The awards succeeded to encourage journalists as individuals or working in teams to search for the hard to find truth, especially when dealing with corrupt practices. Winning reports caused policy changes as well as the removal of officials from their position in government. Sheila Coronel, who has served as Dean of Journalism in the University of Columbia and is a Hall of Famer of the Jaime V. Ongpin Awards, said that the yearly competition provided a much-needed incentive to work on investigative reporting. The very best of all were definitely world-class. We added explanatory reporting as a category for the awards to stimulate reports that help the public understand better a complex issue using the results of other research. And if practiced now, such reporting would have explained from the very beginning the phenomenon of the epidemic, how it spreads, and perhaps the joint system of testing and contact tracing. But even without a crisis, we have become completely aware that the task of keeping citizens informed and knowledgeable can be overwhelming, requiring manifold skills and resources. Thus, journalism should be of different kinds. There is the dogged daily, even hourly updates, such as the tracking of the approach of a monster typhoon or the counting of votes during elections. There are long processes which may not look like news until these constitute a catastrophe, such as environmental degradation and the development that encroaches on wilderness and forests, when hopefully journalists can take interest before it is too late. At some point, with so many gadgets, there was greater requirement for more reporting in brief, catching people with less time, being able to visualize data and identifying patterns that suggest a big story. Today, this morning, our program has two parts. The first we will start shortly, which is a panel discussion among journalists who were chosen because they reported on a concern or a theme or themes which we felt stood out for its impact and significance to Filipinos, or because of the consistent quality of their body of work. The second is a ceremony of recognition when we present certificates and announce special awards. The two parts are joined in a celebration of press freedom, recognizing journalists who put that freedom to good use, fulfilling their role in an institution that is the fourth pillar of democracy. Unlike other programs that give awards, CMFR does not call for self-nomination for a journalist to be considered. No applications necessary, as the search for quality journalism is the business of CMFR. We have Luis Teodoro to explain the process of selection and to present the jurors who served this year. Professor Teodoro is twice Dean of the University of the Philippines College of Mass Communications, where he was professor of journalism until his retirement and where he continues to teach. He writes a column for Business World, is a member of the board of trustees of an NGO, SENPEG, and national chair of Alter Media, and not the least of his responsibilities, a consulting editor for the Philippine Journalism Review, or PJRR, and a member of CMFR's board. I call on Professor Teodoro.
Okay, the process through which CMFR selects the panelists in the JBO Journalism Seminar for this year began, as in past years, with a list of possibles drawn up by the staff of the Philippine Journalism Review Reports, or PJRR for short, CMFR's flagship, now online publication. But the list is based on another list, that of journalists whose work in the past year has been cheered in the PJRR Media Monitor section. The selection of panelists is in that sense a year-long process. The PJRR staff then looked further into the list it had drawn up and refined it. From that list, a steering committee, the membership of which included, among others, senior journalists from the broadcast and print media, drew up in a virtual meeting a short list which was further shortened and finalized during a second meeting online. As in previous years, the steering committee did not rely solely on the PJR reports monitor. Its members, because of their own familiarity with and insights into the work of individual journalists, nominated other practitioners who might not have been in the PJRR shortlist but whom they thought also did exemplary work from July 2019 to June this year. PJR Reports, which is primarily a media monitoring publication in furtherance of encouraging best practice in journalism, and PJR, its antecedent, have been around for over 2 decades. I mention that fact to emphasize that the PJRR media monitors did not come into being and are not specifically intended to help draw up the final list of panelists in the JBO Journalism Seminar. Its main purpose is to recognize best practice and to criticize the bad, which it does in its Media Monitor or Cheers and Jeers section, as well as in full-length online articles. The PJRR monitors are nevertheless a helpful guide in drawing up at least part of the list of panelists. This year, the steering committee was only too aware of the problematic state of journalism because of the pandemic and the demands on reporting it as best as practitioners could, as well as the continuing attacks against practitioners and media organizations. To be of any value, journalism demands independence of its practitioners, as well as meticulous attention to the imperatives of truth-telling through factual accuracy and contextualization. As in past years, the committee was guided in its choice of panelists by this awareness. The members of the selection committee this year were Tina Monzon Palma of ABS-CBN News Channel and ABS-CBN Foundation Program Director, Berhel Santos, former publisher and chair of the editorial board of Business World, Melinda Pintos de Jesus, executive director, the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility, who also moderated the discussions, former New York Times and International Herald Tribune correspondent Carlos Conde, and myself. Thank you and all the best to everyone.
Thank you, Luis. While the period in review did include some 6 months of 2019, news in the first months of 2020 unfolded with an incredible chain of big news that was also very bad news. We thought after the eruption of Taal volcano in early January, what next? Well, now we know. The global pandemic may have distanced the selection committee from very good journalism done earlier on other issues. We have had in the past a panel of 8 to 10 journalists. But given Limited resources, given technical limitations, especially for a digital program, we had to limit the number of panelists to the 6 chosen. Their stories present major concerns, and collectively, the themes include the presence of Chinese militia and China's permanent structures in the West Philippine Sea, the failure of the franchise renewal of the major network ABS-CBN, laws such as the law of the anti-terrorism law, which provides all kinds of opportunities for abuse, raise the specter of more limits to press freedom and to freedom of speech. Thus, this loom over our lives and the additional experience of COVID-19 in the Philippines with a focus on governance issues. It does not mean that there were no other issues or developments worth including in the discussion, but it is on these issues that we have found the best reporting. Ladies and gentlemen, the board selection committee chose the following outstanding journalists as panel discussants in the 2020 Jaime V. Ongpin Journalism Seminar. And let us start in no order of importance except alphabetical order with Miss Lian Buan. Lian covers the justice beat and reports on corruption issues for Rappler. She has looked at legal processes and the courts, prison conditions, examined the human rights impact of Duterte's police-based approach to the pandemic. She also produces and hosts Rappler's podcast, Law in Duterte Land. Lian was part of the team that produced Rappler's award-winning drug series on the drug war, Murder in Manila. Lian is also the associate editor of the online news magazine, subselfie.com. Next, Camille Diola. Camille Diola leads newsroom production, direction, and innovation at Philstar Global Corporation, the digital arm of the Star Group of publications. She started as news reporter for the company in 2012, eventually heading philstar.com as editor-in-chief. In 2015, when she expanded editorial operations, initiating new ways of reporting in depth, and increasing their page views by 100%. Camille is also concurrently the editor-in-chief of Interaccion.com, a rebranded digital news site that reframes online conversations. Next, Christian Esguerra. Christian, formerly a political correspondent for ABS-CBN News. He has covered governance, human rights issues, the Bangsamoro peace process, and the communist insurgency. He continues to anchor the news and interview programs Matters of Fact on ANC. Christian also teaches political journalism, media ethics, and social communications at the University of Santo Tomas. He has also delivered lectures and presented papers on peace, religion, and democracy in international conferences. Next, we have Mike Navalio. Mike is ABS-CBN's reporter for the Justice Beat. His recent work includes the ouster of Chief Justice Maria Lourdes Sereno, petitions filed against the anti-terror law, and the press freedom stories on Maria Resa's cyber libel conviction and ABS-CBN's shutdown. Mike passed the bar exam in 2009. He was formerly a litigator with the CICIP Salazar, Hernandez, and Gatmaitan law firm. He has also worked with Amnesty International as research consultant and co-authored Amnesty's 2014 report, Above the Law, Police Torture in the Philippines, which analyzed the Philippine criminal justice system and disciplinary mechanisms for police officers. Next, we have a senior veteran journalist, Rafi Tima. Rafi is a reporter and news producer for GMA News, GMA network. He has been with the company since 1999. Rafi's recent work includes conflict, such as the 2013 Zamboanga siege and the 2017 Marawi siege. He also anchors the newscast Balitang Hali that airs daily on GMA News TV. Rafi has given lectures on technology and mobile journalism. His Marawi documentary that was filmed with a 360-degree camera earned recognition as Best Immersive Video Report in the 2018 Asian Academy Creative Awards. And now, last but not least, we have Shara Zambrano. Shara is a news correspondent for ABS-CBN. Her journalistic work includes coverage of national defense, conflict, and issues surrounding the West Philippine Sea, where she has been a frequent visitor. She has produced award-winning documentaries for ABS-CBN, among them Spratly's Mga Isla ng Kalayaan and Marawi documentary Di Ka Pasisiil. Chiara has delivered lectures on documentary filmmaking and journalism in Philippine universities. Welcome, all of you, to the panel discussion, and we shall begin just as soon as you get your places on stage. I know that some people think that journalists must be among the most fearless people for just being able to ask questions directly of the president. Not to speak of having to report on a shooting war or having to talk to victims of violence. My opening question then, which has been a custom, to ask you all to give your answer in one sentence. What do you fear most these days as a journalist? And it is perfectly all right if you repeat someone else's fear, because this is a personal response. No wrong answers. It's a way of trying to get the pulse of the media at this moment. Can you share with our audience out there? And just wave your hand if you want to lead. Or shall I call on you? Shall we? Yes, Christian. And then I have Chiara.
Well, this is more of a fear for the industry in general and for many other fellow journalists. The fear of meekness, self regulation, and cowardice in the face of such immense challenge that journalists are facing today.
Thank you. Chiara?
Well, my answer is very close to Christian's, so I'm just going to try to rephrase it a different way. I have the same fear that this chilling effect that we all have now, this urge to temper stories that we tell, I fear that this will continue. I fear that it will spread, that it will worsen, and that one day we may no longer be telling the stories that we should be telling the people.
Thank you. Anyone following? Camille. Camille, go ahead.
Yeah, I am afraid that we will be succumbing to pressures, economic, political, perhaps even psychological and mental, and also compromise our reporting that the reporting we owe to the audience in the process. That's one big fear of mine.
Very good. Leanne, yes, go ahead.
My greatest fear is that the Filipinos lose trust in the news media, because how do we serve the people if the people do not believe us anymore?
Thank you. Taking it from the other end of the exchange, you fear for how the audience will be reacting to the media. And I have the two gentlemen. Rafi, you want to take it?
The same answer. my fear is probably restraint for us working in the media because of fear of being bashed online or fear of being called out in a press conference. So the tendency is for us to restrain ourselves in doing a particular story. So that's my fear.
And finally, Mike.
My fear is losing the war for truth when laws and fact existed and people are no longer able to discriminate fact from fiction. That's my biggest fear.
Thank you so much for being so open with your vulnerability. And I think this is something that we want to share with everyone and basically have them know that this cocky, rambunctious media community that they have always maybe didn't like in the past or celebrated in the past is going through major personal, psychological, economic, professional changes. Let me continue then. The coverage and stick to the pandemic, as it's the current issue, has been a test for government, and it's also been a test for journalists. There has been nothing to compare with it in terms of experience. Can you share with us how this crisis has changed the way you work? And here we shall not go with everyone and maybe leave it to the ones who have actually experienced some differences. And you can let us know how much more difficult it is, for example, to get people to talk to you because it's so much easier to ignore you. Anyone? No change yes, Rafi, thank you.
I don't get easily scared whenever I cover something dangerous, whether that's a coup d'etat or super typhoon or a military operation in the jungles. But there is something about covering a deadly infectious, and in this case, a new disease that really sets this coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic apart from my other coverages. While most of the dangerous coverages I have done before can be pretty much visualized, one can, to some extent, prepare for it. The same cannot be said about the pandemic, especially during the first few months of the lockdown. It was also the first time, not just in my career, but in my lifetime, that life, as I know it, stopped, and that was new. It was very unsettling. But at the same time, as journalists, we did not stop working. We were actually working at warp speed because there were just too many stories to cover. And but to sum it up, I think there's little difference. There's little effect in my life in covering this pandemic, because what I've done was, first and foremost, I wholeheartedly accepted that everything is not what there used to be, and that I'm not the only one affected by this pandemic, and that compared to other people, I am faring better than most. I'm still doing the job I want. I can still go out, and I'm healthy. My loved ones are healthy. Having that mindset, I think, helped me to cope with the sudden, change in everything around me. But of course, I always keep in mind the people who are directly affected by this pandemic as a journalist.
Thank you very much. Yes, Christian. Christian, go ahead.
Okay. I think one concern that I've noticed, and I really have this concern in the middle of this pandemic, is that this has given an excuse for a lot of people in power, for example, government officials, to somehow control the flow of information, especially at this very important time in our history, under which we are experiencing a pandemic. So basically, you notice the tendency of the government, even before, to control the flow of information. But today, they find it much easier to do that. For example, it's very hard of course, it's close to impossible to meet in person with a lot of sources that you used to meet in person before. Now you have to rely on Zoom, you have to rely on Facebook Live, especially during press conferences in Malacanang, whenever they talk about the pandemic response. We know that a lot of us have a lot of questions, but the opportunities are limited because of the technology, because of the distance, because of the pandemic. So I guess this is this is the perfect time for those who would like to take advantage of the situation to really do that, and they're getting it.
Do you find, however, that the limitation supposedly of technology, which is pretty much limitless, right? Is there not something else going on? Would anyone be able to share with us how you feel in terms of the attitude of your usual sources, your usual go-to experts, etc., in government? Can anyone share their experiences in terms of getting interviews?
Well,
Kiara, go ahead.
yes. In terms of getting interviews, at first I thought it would be easier to start getting interviews because none of us have to move around and endure traffic to get to a source, to get to someone who's willing to speak. But from my experience, it does seem to be a little more difficult now because you only get a curated version of what you need, of the truth you need. Sometimes I ask an official for an interview and I am given a video clip of his response, which of course you
Package.
can't quiz because that's all you get. And it's very easy for them to say you can't come to me because we're in quarantine or safety protocols and all of that. So yeah, I do get that sense that we are no longer getting the information that we need, and there have been a lot of very convenient reasons and excuses for sources and officials to not show themselves to us.
Right. Definitely then the limitations to interrogating the topic and interrogating your sources further or more deeply is definitely an effect, I think, given the technology and given the attitudes on the part of the sources, especially in government, who are still the major, most credentialed sources so far in terms of answering questions about the pandemic. Let me move on to how some of these problems have come up, and maybe get your take on it. We all know from reading from other sources, countries, how some of these countries have been able to act fast, took steps, needed to do what they had to do to stem the transmission, to control the cases. And in the Philippines, we were obviously delayed. And the delay in the necessary actions has put us in one of the worst situations, according to WHO, in the region. I think we have enough evidence that government did not seem to know enough about it in the beginning, and maybe even now, and what it had to do during the critical period so that they could be more effective in their strategies. And many officials would say things that were completely just not based on evidence, not based on fact. And yet, in the monitor of CMFR, we would find all of these still recorded and repeated. I want to get your sense of having to do this. What is the obligation? If there is a statement that is obviously untrue or misleading, and you have the context with which to correct that, what is the obligation of the journalist in dealing with these statements? Anyone at all, but I can call on someone. Did you have your hand up, Rafi?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
the obligation of us journalists would be to, tell it straightforward, and even to vet even the official data coming from the government, because sometimes even if it's an official statement, even if it's official data, there might be something amiss about those data.
Right.
I would say the government was very reactionary in dealing with this pandemic, and that was to be expected because this was a new disease. It also made the difference, but this made the difference between a successful management of the pandemic, like what New Zealand and Taiwan did, versus what majority of countries like the Philippines did, which was just to cope with the problem. The disease was somehow 1, 2, 3,
Very
4
good.
steps ahead of us.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else want to add to that? Yes, Lian.
For me, the difficulty really of covering the justice beat is that they will say that the law is open to interpretation. So whoever is the lawyer behind the rostrum would have would project that he has the monopoly of the law's interpretation. Like, for example, the lawyers in Malacanang. But also, the good thing about the legal beat is that the law remains the same. It's just one text. So if you just study the law closely enough, then you can be able to challenge even if you're
You're not a
not
lawyer.
even if you're not a lawyer, you can challenge these lawyers to stick to the law, to stick
So,
to the
so
text of the
far,
law.
what I'm getting is that journalists indeed have to challenge what they are given, what statements they hear, what even data, and the presentation of that data. We are pretty much agreed on the panel, or does anyone also want to give any other perspective here that where we would appreciate help the audience appreciate sometimes how we keep getting things repeated, and that's it becomes the narrative. Shara, your hand up again, and I have Mike, and then we shall move to the next question.
Yeah, I guess I can give a couple of examples that would just illustrate how easy and how necessary it is to quiz and interrogate the numbers. Remember, there was a time when the government station was streaming at length a lot of their updates, a lot of their data on each of our channels, on each of our news organizations, which we allowed because that at the early part of the pandemic, everything was happening very fast, and they were the ones who were in charge of figuring things out for all of us and setting the new rules. But you at some point you do have to stop and look at the figures that they're giving. I remember at the start they were giving very low numbers for COVID deaths, which they heralded as a victory or a good sign that they were doing things right. So I honed in on that, and I looked at the crematories,
Yes.
the hospitals, the morgues, and we found that there are a lot more unexplained deaths that just can't be counted as COVID deaths because they were never tested. So where do these people go? Where do these numbers go? Where do their stories end? So
Okay.
we did a piece about that. And right now, just more recently, the start of online classes of blended learning was again
Right.
heralded as a victory. But when
Right.
we went to the communities who were just, uh, were not even able to have afford any of the gadgets that would allow them
Right.
to participate in online learning. They were the ones who were saying that this is not a victory to us. If anything, it's still an ongoing battle that we're not sure
Thank
we're
you.
gonna win, but just we're gonna try. So those are two examples.
Okay. Thank you, Shara. And two on separate fields, that is, thank you. Mike, I had your hand, and we shall then move to the next question after you give us your sense.
Yes, beyond rectifying untrue and inaccurate information, I think it's also important for the media to look at government response to this crisis. And we've seen how the government seems to have tried to consolidate power, taking advantage of this pandemic. For instance, there was a proposal from Malacanang trying to give emergency powers to the government, to the president, to address the pandemic, which included provisions on takeover of telcos, which needed to be reported. Eventually, they withdrew that particular provision. And there was also this document about the military telling its troops to prepare for a martial law type response. And I think that people should also know what the government is doing with respect to this pandemic. Are they doing the right approach in order to address this health problem?
And basically, then you find that the obligation is to help the audience look at the issues and the problems themselves. And if they have to talk back to government, that is their right in a democracy. I think a lot of what the custom is needs to have been changed by what we've experienced in the pandemic. How would you rate, however, the media in responding to this experience? How well have we done? Don't think of yourselves. How well has the institution or the community done? Christian, go ahead.
Just like to clarify, ma'am, are you asking this question in the context purely of the pandemic response or other issues that happened
I was at
during
I
this
was
scenario?
actually thinking of the pandemic response, but if there is any other aspect that you want to hone in, you are perfectly free to do so. So you're free.
Okay, mahaba yan.
Yeah, wag mo lang masyadong habaan kasi
Okay,
marami pa
specific to the
magsasalita. Yeah.
specific to the pandemic response. I think, as always, the, the 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 coverage can still improve a lot. But you notice that there's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of effort on the part of media to clarify things, to hold people to account, and that's a good thing. You see that during the press conference of the regular press conference of Malacanang of Harry Roque. You see a lot of good questions, clarifying things in that press conference, despite the limitations of that particular arrangement. But if you look at the other issues, for example, that have been happening as well under this scenario, for example, yung ABS-CBN franchise issue, um, at this point, for example, the current squabble for the speakership, you see that there's still this tendency for a lot of media practitioners to fall for the spin of people in government, in power, of contending parties. And I think we have to do a much better job to be critical despite all the limitations. I mean, kailangan ng karagdagan tapang. Kasi I think, sadly speaking, a lot of us in the media are actually meek.
Yes, it is. Well, actually, institutionally, the media and journalism in itself has been historically reactionary. Ano yung balita? And then you look at what has happened and you cover what has happened. And that's actually the framework, I think, given the kinds of issues that have arisen in the world, that we must start to move away from. And you can just continue with that question or follow through with this whole idea of the reactionary tendency of media to just wait for government, and government then sets the news agenda. How about setting the news agenda and making that the obligation? Is this something so far-fetched in terms of newsroom practices? Can I call on Camille? Camille?
Yes, ma'am. I think I've spoken about this so many times before also, that we really find that the current structure of how the media are reporting from separate beats contribute to the problem and to the reporting in general, that we are just really tackling one agency after the next and then moving from issue to issue. And it's actually when the press conferences are called and the agenda is set there by the speaking official, and of course the media could always answer or ask questions there. But at the same time, I think the things in between, those that fall into the cracks, the gaps in reporting, are not as much tackled. So as you said, we do need to have a more agenda setting goal or mission, that we are actually the ones putting forth the issues, even from the ground. You know, what we've been hearing from communities, from organizations. I think also these are extraordinary circumstances that we have found ourselves in, and perhaps the most difficult. Being confined, it's not just the physical limitations, but also the logistical problems. But at the same time, it's also a great opportunity. For example, that this is for the first time in history, this is a global problem. It's a global coverage, and for the local media to just make it super local, that we are not interpreting events and facts in a way that others have already interpreted it in the US or in Britain. We miss that opportunity to actually also tap the expertise abroad, to look at the issues here. I think that's one miss that we could have done.
Very good. Thank you so much. And I am noting this because we have faculty in the audience, and that I think part of the conventional framework of news maybe the change needs to begin in how they are taught. If the story is go to the beat and ask them what has happened, then it takes you back to just reacting to the how the government wants you to cover the news. There is a news agenda setting for journalism. Let me move on unless someone is just wanting to jump in there with another thought. Very quickly, yes, Rafi.
Yeah, I think we could have done better. We tend to concentrate on stories that are coming from the government. And also, I think we need more follow-ups on certain stories. There is a tendency for some stories to be left behind because of the very fast news
Definitely.
cycles. I think we can improve on that.
Definitely. Time, for so long as the story hasn't been told, there is a way of telling it, right? Even if the news cycle has been taken over by another issue. Was that your hand, Lian? No? Okay, fine. Developments in the last decade have called for journalists to know more about complex issues as these break out as news. News conventions have always warned that complexity gets in the way of a good story. Too complex, masyadong mahirap ikwento. Let me call on Mike. Given your legal background, your being a lawyer, it has surely helped you that you have a law degree in covering legal issues like journalists, like other journalists who are dependent on the statements of whoever, the court administrator or one side or the other of lawyers. Tell us what you have had to bear in mind relating the cases you have covered. I'm particularly thinking here of the Ampatuan case, which was hailed truly as a victory in terms of the guilty conviction. But what in your, and I want you to talk as a lawyer journalist, and whether you had to work, whether this was a problem for you to do, and think of the whole issue of complexity. Remember, the trial was like all of 9 or 10 years, right? Please go.
Well, it's quite difficult because the issue is very complex. And given the nature of the medium, for instance, I'm reporting for TV, and there's usually this convention that if you report for television, especially if it's in Tagalog, you can only say so much. So you can only explain a few details in broad strokes. So I think that's a struggle, trying to ferret out information so that what actually comes out is just a distilled information that the public needs to know, the barest minimum. And I guess the struggle with that is that you leave out certain details. I would have wanted, for instance, to explain why some Ampatuans were actually acquitted, why there were some who were actually convicted. And we're able to do that in the English newscast with longer time, but that's, I think, the challenge in reporting for a broader public, that you have to bring it to the level that they could easily understand. And it's complex because you have different types of involvement. You have the principal accused here who actually plotted and actually did all the acts that were accused. They were accused of, and you also have accomplices or those who actually participated, and their degree of participation. We tried to explain this in our online article, how some Ampatuans were able to get away with murder, while others did not. And it's my hope that eventually we'll be able to do that on television, Tagalog television as well.
Thank you very much. And the other one who covers law and its complexities, Lian, would you like to share your experience being a non-lawyer?
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, the story that comes to mind almost instantly is the good conduct time allowance law. And I feel like I've agonized over this for the past year. It's hard because the law is so confusing, and proof of that is that senators cannot agree on it, the DOJ cannot agree on it, the Supreme Court does not agree with it, and it's also cultural because Filipinos hate bad men. We want to see them rot in jail, and that goes to the spin of the Duterte administration's hatred for heinous crimes. So when Duterte gives an ultimatum to arrest already freed convicts, it aligns to the culture of the Filipinos to want to see these convicts go back to jail. But what I said earlier is that the good thing about the law, no matter how confusing it gets, is that there are texts that are so clear that it tells the story for you. So what I have had to keep in mind is that whenever there are confusion, at pag ang gulo-gulo na, just focus on the text of the law, which says you cannot hold back people who have already been freed. There is equal protection. So why are you doing this? So in the entire coverage of the GCTA, I just have had to focus on that and to focus on the fact that our laws and our constitution are grounded on rehabilitative justice, on the rehabilitative principle of justice. So my coverage of the GCTA has had to rely on that.
Thank you. Let's move on to another topic. Chiara, you have been covering the West Philippine Sea. I know it is not easy to get to the area and you probably have not made recent visits. How do you feel in terms of the issues of sovereignty gaining traction in the public mind? Tell us how you have had to break down the complexity of this issue, or to just zero in on the very simple fact that this is Philippine territory. I mean, in what way what was your approach to this West Philippine Sea territory question? Go ahead.
Well, it was very hard, especially at the start, because the audience of our newscast, TV Patrol, are from the lower socioeconomic classes. So you always have to find a way to tell a story, no matter how complex, as simply as you can. And it was extremely hard to break down the UNCLOS, the difference between territory and maritime rights and sovereignty and sovereign rights. You could try to do that and just, be very factual and precise about it. But the Filipino audience, the ordinary Filipino folk who have never seen the West Philippine Sea and probably never will, they are not going to care. So you will just probably end up talking to yourself and patting yourself on the back for being or sounding smart. So what I had to do was to find Filipinos there that they could relate to. The ordinary fishermen whose everyday lives are affected by this very big, complex international maritime dispute. My goal at the time was to get people to care first, and once they care, I believe that they would listen more, and then I could get into more details about what the UNCLOS is, what the West Philippine Sea is versus the South China Sea, and all of that. And my measure of success really is when I talk to taxi drivers or security guards who sometimes they don't know me, but we end up talking about the West Philippine Sea, and sometimes they're the ones who bring it up. And I just pump my fist quietly in triumph at the back of the vehicle and just say, that was the goal.
Very good.
But that's just the start.
Yes, and I think the problem may not be so much anymore about the traction with the public mind, because it's easy to sympathize with the fishermen who can no longer fish, be being chased around in your waters, etc., etc. There may not be, what we may not be succeeding in doing is getting more talking heads from government, so that there can be a consensus within government as well as to how to proceed without declaring war, which of course everybody agrees we don't declare war, but there are other options, and those options, I think, must become part of the coverage of the West Philippine Sea. May I?
Could I add to that point
Okay,
briefly?
very quickly.
Yes.
Yes, briefly. Go ahead.
Of course, that shift happened in 2016. The way I describe it to some people is that, the West Philippine Sea story was an apple before, and come 2016, the government just, up and told us, that this is actually an orange, that the bullies from before are actually our friends, and the threats from before are now actually opportunities for us to grow as a nation. It has been very difficult compared to before 2016, to quiz officials about the West Philippine Sea. All of their responses so far have been very sparse and sometimes even conflicting compared to what they already said from months ago. So that is the battle now. That how do you put things into context? Why is the government now saying something completely opposite to what we have been reporting from years ago? And when they say that, the whole war narrative of we don't want war, we can't survive war, so we
Okay.
have to keep quiet. You just have to tell stories about what our regional neighbors are doing, and just
Yeah.
through their actions we get to disprove some of these claims. Yeah, so that's the struggle now.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And on one, we're beginning to come to the end of the panel discussion itself, and I hope the audience is picking up in terms of whatever questions we may not have taken up. Then you have your opportunity after we close this back and forth between me and the panel, then you will be able to ask your questions as well. So please take note of what has been covered so we're not going over the same ground. The government keeps insisting, we've always enjoyed this reputation of having a really free press. We're the only country in the region that has the First Amendment written into the Constitution, the full protection of the press. And I've had colleagues basically say, you really have it written that way. When are we going to get that? When are we going to get that? But there is now a question, I think, and maybe people are divided as well. What do you think? The government keeps insisting that there is a free press continuing to operate in the country. In fact, this panel may be proof of this, right? What do you have to say? And free for all, anyone who catches my thing with the arm or an eyebrow, or Leanne, I have Rafi, I have Camille, I have Mike. Did I have Mike? Oh, well, maybe we can have this as the final question. Let's go. Leanne, did I start with Leanne or Rafi? Sorry. Leanne?
Okay. Yeah, they can claim that there is a free press, but also in the background, the prescription for cyber libel has gone from 1 year to 12 years. How can you stretch the prescription period of a law from 1 year to 12 years? There's the anti-terror law, which is going to be effective on October 14 when the IRR is published. And there is a inciting to terrorism has been a crime. There is prior restraint. Our reporter, Pia
I
Renadin
still have what,
Malacanang,
30 minutes?
has not been allowed to Malacanang, and that is prior restraint. ABS-CBN doesn't have franchise anymore, and that's also prior restraint. So they can claim that there's a free press, but all this weaponization of all these laws prove that it's actually less free.
Meaning we are targeted press. Right. Next, I had Rafi's hand, right? Sorry.
Yeah, yeah. There are obviously a lot of challenges. Foremost of which is the freedom to criticize and point out mistakes without being labeled an enemy. No, there's no doubt. No, you can still exercise that freedom, but nowadays you are not sure what the effect of exercising that freedom would be. Of course, we do this as part of our job, as a fourth estate, and our expectation is whatever wrong we see and point out, that will be dealt with. That something will be done about it. But nowadays, it seems the default action is question the motive and integrity of the journalist, and not the issue he brought up. So if every time you come up with a story that one camp feels is negative to them, you get attacked and the story is dismissed. Obviously, in this case, something is really wrong.
Thank you. I had other hands a little while back. Just go ahead. I have Christian, I have Camille, I have Mike. Go. Christian.
Okay. Well, we still have freedom, some measure of freedom, but we're talking here of eroding freedoms, and they are happening fast under this administration, under this climate. Because I think early on, this was part of, I won't say it was part of the strategy, but it was part of the predisposition of the administration, of the president himself, to actually control certain institutions, the church, the other branches of government, including media. And you don't have to look far. For example, this might sound self-serving, but Look at what happened to ABS-CBN. Could you imagine the biggest media network in the Philippines being shut down, being refused a new franchise for all those bogus reasons that came out during the congressional hearings? They tried to put a semblance of legitimacy in those hearings, but he knew for a fact why ABS-CBN was shut down. It was all because of President Duterte. And you could see how easy it was for those in power to try to spin the issue to their favor. They were saying that the president had nothing to do with it, but look at what happened. And the other thing that I'm very much concerned about is the pushback or the lack of sufficient pushback coming from the industry itself, coming from ABS-CBN itself. So this is what's bothersome given the climate that we are
Yes.
under now.
And we have Camille or Mike? Camille?
Yes, it's true. We are still free to a certain point, but as Christian has already said, it is eroding, and we do feel it. And we cannot pretend that the towering issues of ABS-CBN and Rappler being attacked do not affect us. I think what remains to be seen, and basically these people do not hear this often, but these have a real effect in newsrooms and the way we report. Also, the attitudes of politicians who are vindictive and onion skinned, who cannot even take constructive criticisms, that they take criticisms as if all of them are plots to destabilize or an attack on government, that they cannot even hear real feedback from a very legitimate sector, the health sector, doctors and experts in this particular health crisis, and see it as something that can help them, make them tweak their approach. So if they don't even listen to the sectors, and they take the criticisms as an attack on them, what more can we do? What more is the effect on the media? That chilling effect is something that we do have to talk about and document, and really specify in detail, even after this
And I certainly
administration.
hope that there is that work being done, documenting cases of the chilling of the freedom. Yes, Mike.
Yes, I just want to address persistent line coming from Malacanang in justifying the shutdown of ABS. You're saying that there are other sources anyway, so you can't say that freedom is there. But it must be pointed out that just because others are broadcasting still doesn't mean that you don't have a personal violation on the part of ABS-CBN and the journalists of ABS-CBN who have been deprived of that particular right to be able to express themselves or through the press to broadcast and report their stories about national concerns. And just because a franchise is a privilege does not mean that it trumps that particular right, press freedom and freedom of expression. So I'll say this in Tagalog to make people understand the issue. Hindi dahil humihinga ka sa bibig dahil tinakpan yung ilong mo, it doesn't mean na hindi ka na pinigilan ng huminga. So there is that restriction on press freedom, and that is something that we need to recognize.
Did we lose Chiara? Did she want to speak on this? I am moving to the last question for the panel, and I want you to think about this a little bit. Somebody a little earlier brought up the issue of losing the trust. And I interpret that as partly losing the trust because you no longer behave as an autonomous institution or a community that reflects the autonomy and the independence of the media. We are, after all, identified in our system of democracy as a fourth pillar of the system. And I would like for you to think a little bit and think forward into the future, or even in the current context, if you would. How do you regain autonomy? How do you make that your practice? How, if the newsrooms, because the dominant fears of the owners are somewhat perpetrating into the practice or getting into the way of the practice, how do we become a stronger free press? Christian, yes.
Sorry for frequently volunteering.
No, that is fine for
I'm
an
just,
interviewer.
I'm just about this. I mean, we know the restrictions, we know the limitations that we have given the media structure we have in the Philippines. Ownership usually compromise. You have business owners. We have owners of media organizations also owning other businesses. And you see a lot of conflicts of interest. But I will always point this out. There has to be a culture. There has to be a clear um, line between the editorial side and the business side. Meaning, if you are the owner and you own this particular broadcast industry or this particular company, you have to respect the independence of the editorial. But if you are an ordinary reporter, that is definitely beyond your pay grade. So my point is, as journalists, I suggest we can start with ourselves, with every article that we write, with every interview that we conduct. Let's not allow those people in power get away with a lot of lies, reports that are obviously bogus, a lot of BS out there. They're all over the place. I mean, the moment that you notice something erroneous, not factual, being peddled by the person you're interviewing, call them out right away. And then in an article, you have to do it in an honest to goodness way until such time that this becomes infectious because your colleagues in the media would know that this is the right thing to do. Until later on, this becomes part of the newsroom culture. And even those who would like to control the way media is behaving inside the newsrooms, they would find it very hard to do that because that becomes infectious and that becomes cultural in the long term. The culture of pushback.
Yes. Pushing back. Um, there are, however, real viruses affecting the practice of the press, and some of you, I hope, in responding to this question as well, will think of corruption in the media. Every time I have been given this response, what can you do about the corruption in the media? And I say, well, what do you do about the corruption in the rest of society? Because media is interactive with that. But I think this is another issue that we might want to include in this looking forward and how we regain our autonomy and our trust. Everyone had her hand up, and so I have had Rafi, Christian. Rafi?
Yeah, our situation really makes you reflect as a journalist. Now, am I doing my job well? Are my research, solid? My data and my information based on hard evidence? Meron bang butas yung story ako? Because for me, that is the only way anyone can question the integrity of a journalist. When the story he comes up with is baseless and made up. But having said that, people make mistakes. And so the determination of whether a journalist is really doing his or her job should be made on a parang per story basis. Di ba? Ang nakakalungkot lang kasi ngayon, one post, one tweet, or one story, and you are already labeled. Diba? So I think something positive that can be drawn out of this situation is journalists are forced to be always on their toes. And we have become even more careful in doing a story. And by that, I mean, we make sure the basis of our story are solid. We research more and double check even more or triple check everything before publishing a story. Ang aim, of course, is para wala talagang butas yung story natin, di ba? And so this situation should somehow make us better as journalists, I think. And I hope.
So better journalism will win back the territory. And the next hand I had was Mike. Camille, sorry.
All right. I think we're talking about journalistic trust. And what's tricky here for us actually is that government's lines and statements are very simple. It's more simplistic actually. They tend to be understood better by, say, the public because it's just A and B. Even if, for example, in our mind, that doesn't make sense. And things are more nuanced than what the government is trying to portray it to be. So that is a challenge because people tend to understand government officials better, and even if they do not make sense, they repeat it often enough, and perhaps no, not perhaps, the media are also guilty of repeating it more, and so it becomes quote unquote the truth. So how do we regain this autonomy? I think because our bias is we are in the digital space, upskilling and being ahead, really harnessing technology to our advantage. We cannot let government use technology better than we are. And of course, we're not just tackling here about disinformation and all these disinformation campaigns that are very well oiled, but on our part is actually also upskilling, harnessing, and developing other modes of reporting and communication to reach the audience better, for us to understand, for them to understand us better.
Thank you. And our Mike, yes, you're on, and I have Shara, and will that have done? I have picked up. I'm sorry, Lian is still there. Yes, Mike.
I think it's also important to recognize that I think we also need to band together and address and get accountability from the platforms and social media, which are also responsible for spreading misinformation. I think Maria Ressa is spearheading this project, calling out Facebook, for example, for allowing misinformation or disinformation to flourish in that media. Certain steps have been taken, but it's also important that the media plays an active role in this, because we cannot just allow trolls and other propagandists to dominate social media. We have to take control of that space as well.
Very good. Thank you. And I have Shara and Lian, and then I shall go to Shara for the last.
Yeah, just going off what Mike said, I think first we have to acknowledge that we have, if not losing, we are being clobbered in the war of propaganda. I think the first step to solving a problem is acknowledging that there is a problem. And I think one solution to winning this war is showing a more united front as a media, not just supporting each other in each other's battles, like supporting ABS-CBN in its franchise woes. I think it's showing a united front when it comes to stories. It's our nature to always want to outscoop each other. But I think we have to do a better job at collaborating. We don't have to share kodigo. Hindi naman natin kailangang maging, we don't have to be a cartel to do that. I think we just have to follow up on each other's questions, follow up on each other's stories, and recognize that if our message is louder, if the truth that we know it is the truth is louder, then we have a better chance at beating the
Absolutely.
trolls.
I really want to hold that, because we find that every story has so many other stories connected to it. And leaving it only at some level is certainly a journalistic failure. And everyone can have a piece of that story. And everyone going to that story gets that bigger truth out there. And yet, unfortunately, we find that the media holds back on this. You don't like to refer to anything that one institution or one news organization has already come forward, put it out there and says, well, that's a story that goes to blah, 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 or whatever news organization. It did not used to be that way. We used to be able to connect to everyone's stories and enlarge them in different ways by looking at the first break and then finding out where else to go from there. And that is how most mature press communities should actually be working in terms of that solidarity and in terms of that promotion of trust. And Shara will have the last word.
Well, my take here is twofold. First is just to second what Christian said. We do have to be braver now. The time for relying on press releases and press conferences is over. If there ever should have been a time to just rely on press releases. We need to be giving our A game now. We have to use more than just reporting what was said during a press conference. You have to take that what was said and just shed out, peel away the spin, and tell the real story behind it. And unfortunately, it may be because of the daily grind that not a lot of reporters are able to do that now. A lot of reporters have just been relegated to just event reporting. Who, what, where, when. but the meat of the matter is always in the why and the how. And to that, I think the newsrooms themselves have to somehow find a way to liberate some of their reporters and give them more space to detach themselves from the daily grind, from the daily press conferences and PRs, and let them hone in, let them latch on to one particular important story and roll with it, because that's when you will get the better quality stories. I myself
Okay.
am a beat reporter, and I experience just the limitations of time and just me wanting to focus on this, but also me having to cover so many other things. And the newsrooms can help in this respect, and I think they should.
Thank you very much for all your thoughts and sharing with us so openly what the experience that you are going through at this time. And I want to thank you all for the work that you do. It is time for us to bring in the audience and for you then to know who is out there. We opened the program to the participation of colleges and universities around Metro Manila in the late 1990s. The seminar had been chaired by faculty who told us that they based lessons, class time on the content of the program, of the seminar. And in the length of the time of the program, some of the students attending entered the field as media practitioners. And we do cherish the story of one of student who had attended the seminar as a student and made a comeback as a journalist panelist of the JVO, going full circle with her participation. There were years when students came from Bulacan and from Bicol, and I was thrilled with that because they physically traveled to the program and to be there. On the digital platform, however, I am happy to say that we have had requests from the Visayas, Iloilo, and from Baguio and other places. I think I would like now for the panel to know all the different schools who are here. And just by the order, I think, of their registration, let me just call out the list. Assumption College, Cavite State University, Centro Escolar University Manila, Colegio de San Juan de Letran, Far Eastern University, Hercor College, Kalayaan College, Lyceum of the Philippines, University of Manila, Pamantasan ng Lungsod ng Marikina, Pamantasan ng Lungsod ng Valenzuela, Polytechnic University of the Philippines, St. Paul's University Manila, St. Scholastica's College, the University of the Cordilleras in Baguio, University of Iloilo, University of the Philippines, Diliman, University of the Philippines, Los Baños, University of the Philippines, Visayas, University of Santo Tomas, University of Science and Technology of Southern Philippines, and the West Visayas State University. Usually, if we had a physical program, I would ask all the different tables to stand up, and so that everybody gets to know who's from where. And it's a lovely, cheerful moment that I cherish. But now I imagine that you know where you are, and that we shall now continue. Open the program to questions or comments from our registered guests. You type this on your chat box, and we will try to give you all as much time as possible. I will read the comments, if I can do that, and I will be helped in this task. I will be helped in this task with our question moderator, CMFR staff member Geraldine Pascual. Do we have questions ready? Aha, we have a question from Jonathan De Santos from PhilStar, another journalist. How can the media unlearn its meekness? Given, for example, that economic and political realities in an administration that has been more than eager to rule by not to rule by law, to rule by law. I know what you're talking about, Jonathan. Yes, meekness is part of your of the fact that you are employed. And so how do we overcome this? And anyone, maybe we will not take everyone, but let's go. Christian, go ahead.
I think we can start by clarifying our loyalties as journalists, our commitments as a journalist. Are we simply loyal, blind followers to, let's say, employers or those who provide our paycheck? Or more importantly, are we looking at the higher cause, which is our loyalty to the truth and our commitment to the citizens? So, of course, this is in a book, The Elements of Journalism. But my point is, if journalists take these things to heart, there shouldn't be much problem in terms of understanding what the rules are. But of course, this is easier said than done because this would also entail a lot of sacrifices as well. You might lose your job in the process. You might encounter a lot of pressures along the way, but that's the way things are. And I think
Yes.
part of the problem is that Filipino journalists are generally, they have this culture, parang masyadong mabait, we're too polite. And the moment that we start challenging certain claims by certain people in government, people would automatically think that we are impolite, we are bastos. I think we should do away with that. I mean, it's part of the job.
Not be bastos, but to take a stand.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a way of taking a stand, and I have had news organization owners basically say, so and so, I can't touch that. I would have to find a way if I were in conflict with this particular or that particular reporter, and it stands out. And they know that if they got rid of that person, that it would be a reflection on them. Rafi, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I think we should change the mindset of society, that although our stories may be negative for certain camps or certain governments, it's because that is the nature of the story, and not because we just want to put out a negative story. For example, how can we come up with a corruption story without hitting anyone? That is not possible.
Sure.
Meron talagang tatamaan, di ba? And most likely it's those who are in power. So the challenge is making sure the story is objective enough that those in power will not question your motive as a journalist. And sadly, that is easier said than done. Now, more and more people seem to be adopting the belief that if you're not with me, then you are against me. Of course, we all know that that is not the case.
Yes, we should talk a little bit more about it so that people know how it goes, how this business goes, right? Mike, I think I will take that, and then Shara, okay, and we will move on to the next question when that is ready. Mike, let us hear from you.
Well, I think it's also important that we as journalists enable each other. We support each other. So if someone, for example, gets to trouble, for instance, for a story, either with a politician or with the employer, it's important to show support. And just to send the message that we're not taking this sitting down. There has to be that constant support for each other so that we can push back and push the limits more, and to send the message that this is necessary.
Very good. Yes, we don't do that enough. Not such a strong sense of solidarity. I think if there was both institutional and community solidarity, that people would think twice about unfair attacks on journalists as individuals. Did I have any other hand that I should call? Shara and then Lian. Okay, and then we move to the next question.
I think it's time. Yeah, I think it's time that journalists ask themselves why they're in this job. Because if they're just here for the paycheck, then they will be meek forever until the day they retire. But ask yourself and remind yourself what the profession is. Similar to what Christian said, where is your loyalty? Is it to the paycheck? Is it to the truth and to the profession itself? It's the only way for you to just battle this heavy weight of fear, this heavy weight of reluctance that's on all of us. I feel it myself, and I've gone through this discernment process myself. I had to talk to myself. What are you in this, for the long haul? Is this the kind of life that you want, where you're always getting attacked and no day is light and safe? and then you remember what the job is, and you realize this is a necessary evil in order for you to function the way that you're supposed to function as a journalist. It's internal. It's a decision that you have to make. It's not, and that's the first step. And after that, you just keep practicing, push the walls, push the boundaries, push the officials,
Okay.
and push the spin.
Okay. Thank you. And I have Leanne.
I think we start to unlearn meekness by trying to evaluate for ourselves how much do we value access. What are we willing to compromise to protect that access? And then we find that line and then draw that line. Ito yung kaya kong i-compromise para sa access ko. And then you do your homework after, because the people you cover in government, you share the same passion. You might be on opposite ends of the ideological divide, but you both share the same passions. For example, in my beat, we both share the same passion for the law. So we might disagree and clash with each other, but these people will eventually respect that you know what you're talking about, and you're going to be ignored a lot of times, day in, day out, week in, week out. But if you just show tenacity and commitment to the story that they're also passionate about, you're going to make it hard for them to ignore you.
Thank you. So you have all taken it from the different aspects of this particular issue of how do you overcome meekness. And I think, just as a practical advice, I think every journalist should have a second trade. I had a senior journalist woman that I talked to a long time ago, who basically said, I know how to do nails. I can do a professional manicure. I know how to bartend, and so I will be able to do that if I have to. I mean, there is a line, and if I can't do it anymore as a journalist, then I have to find another livelihood. Right. Do we have our next question from Hamila Beatriz Delera for Lian Buan? It's a question for you, Lian. Mentioned earlier, she fears that Filipinos will lose their trust in the media, given that fake dissemination has been widespread, especially now during the lockdown. As media people, how do we combat this? Okay, it's not just for Lian. I've already seen a handful of people who have already lost their trust in the media, and it is alarming.
I think I have already covered that base kanina when I said that we should show a more united front, stronger front, better collaboration.
Okay, anyone else want to add to this loss of trust as a result, perhaps, of propaganda against the media, especially the mainstream media? And so, is there another way in which we can respond and defend ourselves? Is basically, what do we do about this loss of trust? Or do we just wait for the turning of the page and find out, if there is going to be an administration that will say, no matter what, with all its imperfections, the press must be free? This is a problem, it looks to me, for our panel. Yes, Rafi, you had your hand up.
I don't know if I have an answer for that, but that is a challenge facing journalists nowadays. Now, I know of colleagues who now prefers to just do non-controversial stories because they can't handle being bashed on social media. Now, they won't even post their thoughts about certain issues anymore because they are afraid they will be bashed online or be verbally attacked in a press conference. And for me, that is a prior restraint, as mentioned earlier by Leah. When you have that kind of culture, when there is focus on the journalist and not on the story, it becomes unhealthy. Now, sure, nobody's threatening the journalist not to do his or her job, but if the environment is so hostile that it makes the journalist think twice about doing a story, not because of lack of data or lack of evidence or lack of attribution on a particular story, but because of fear of how the subject of the story will react, then the effect is the same. It's prior restraint. It may not be done overtly, but the effect is the same, and I think that is very sad.
And therefore, it is the proxy prior restraint by proxy. Government has found a way by which you can be afraid of the consequences of being attacked and vehemently attacked. And there have been lots of discussions about what to do with with that kind of false propaganda that has weakened the press, has influenced, strengthened the meekness of the press, not wanting to rock the boat and everything. And I really think that maybe it's not just the solution does not come from the press anymore. It has to come from the rest of society. I mean, I have to say, I'm sorry, you can't expect a press that is already being hit the way we've been hit and expect us to do all the work in terms of defending us. I mean, the press is part of that society, and that society must become a stronger ally if you want us to build up the good that we have. Maybe not completely, but definitely assist us in recovering our place in society. Do we have the next? Yes, Christian, you want to add to that? Yeah.
Just want to add something with what Rafi said earlier. Parang some of our colleagues now prefer to do non-controversial stories. I'm sorry, but I have to say this. Parang if you don't have courage, if you have a coward, you should not be in journalism. I mean, simple as that. Because you need. I'm not telling this to Rafi, to our colleagues
And you know
who
some
are
of them.
feeling that way. You have to have. Oh, dapat meron kang intentional fortitude. And this one I always quote this, and I keep forgetting who made this quote. Yung self-censorship is the most insidious form of censorship. Once that happens,
Wala na.
those in power have already
Wala na.
succeeded. Wala na talaga. And I think this is happening. This is happening now to a lot of us, and it's very despicable. I mean, I don't feel sorry for that, but simply, I despise that idea.
Yes. Okay. I think the panel will agree with that. Let me just add one little thing. You know, I sat in a conference of a review of martial law many years ago, and a very senior colleague basically recounted the day in which he submitted himself to the censorship of the day of the killing of Ninoy Aquino. And he said, I had to do it. I had a child who was sick, and I could not think of losing my job at that time. I have spent all these years haunted by my failure to say no to that pressure. And he was speaking to a huge audience, and that audience was completely silenced because here was a man who said, the consequence of that and having to do what we had to do at that time basically has left him somewhat scarred for the rest of his life. Do we have our next question? Justin Ray, AB Communication student from Scholastica. What scares you as a journalist now that the anti-terror bill has been signed into law? Okay, focus on the anti-terror because we did talk about fear earlier during the panel discussion. The anti-terror law, let us specify how vulnerable we are because of the anti-terror law. Again, let me start with the lawyer, and then I think Camille's hand was a little bit coming up there, etc. Okay, and Shara. And Lian. Okay, let's go. Just think of the time, please, so that we give each other enough time to talk. Yes, Mike, go ahead.
What's scary about the Anti-Terrorism Act is that you can get arrested on the basis of mere suspicion, and on that basis you can be detained for up to 24 hours, up to 24 days, and there are number of days that all of which could not be done without this law. And in fact, some people are pointing out that this is beyond what the Constitution allows. So that's scary. They don't have a case against you. They don't have evidence yet. They can just arrest you.
Very good. Thank you. Who did I call? Camille? Did I call Camille? Was it your hand?
Ma'am. Yes. I don't really get why some people even still defend this law. We have to read it in the context of the times. And we have to read it in terms of how the government has been to the press and its attitude towards people who criticize them. And the government will be interpreting this law and implementing it. Do we actually think that this will not affect not just the press, but also individual practitioners, and also social media users? And I
Social
think we've
media.
already had cases like that. So even private people will be targeted, possibly targeted under this law. So are we afraid of it? Definitely. And we should all be.
Thank you. Next, anyone else want to add to that? Shiara.
I fear it because, again, as Mike said, just on mere suspicion, they can do so many things to you. It does say a provision there says that that the press is protected, but if they twist it into saying that we are suspicious that this member of the press might be linked to communists and terrorists, then that opens up the anti-terror law to you and all the provisions of it. They can start bugging your phones. They can start, the wiretapping, following you around. And this doesn't only endanger me, it also endangers the sources that I speak to on condition of anonymity because, of the danger to their lives. And some people say this is still a concept and just an object of my imagination, but the NTF-LCAC itself has already red tagged ABS-CBN, and they even managed to come out with an entire infographic about why we are doing illegal things and why we deserve to be shut down. And it was actually supported by the Defense Secretary because he said explicitly that we have been attacking President Duterte, which is why we deserve to be suspected of illegal actions. It's reality now. It's no longer, my imagination. And there is every reason for us to fear.
And Diane, for the last word on this issue, the anti-terror.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I would just like to take the opportunity to tell the students who are watching this and the one who asked to look at section 4, the one there that starts with provided. It says dissent is protected, but there's a second line that says dissent is not protected if it intends to cause harm. That is the killer caveat. And whenever you encounter someone who tries to defend this law, just cite this. This caveat has allowed the burden of proof to be shifted from the prosecution to you as the person. I'd like to think that the press will able to withstand this. I would like to think that the press would push back. But not everyone has the protection of prominence that we enjoy. I am afraid because I fear that the conversation will just be among the journalists going forward and that everybody who has been with us in this war will clamp up, will be silent. So I do not fear for us. I fear for the rest who may not be as protected as we are.
And let us call then attention to the cases, the motions in the Supreme Court that have questioned the constitutionality of this law. This is not just for the media to look at, and the discourse that comes from your social media, wherever you are there, wherever you're talking, everyone becomes vulnerable. Everyone becomes vulnerable because the person or the agency that wants to target you can do so. And the courts have already shown how they can also be compliant because that is how they read the law, however unconstitutional it may be. And so I think the public sense of the evil of the anti-terror bill or law should actually be out there a little bit more than what it is now. As usual, when there is a discussion about the law, people shut up and or hold up their hands to their ears and basically don't want to get involved because it is too expert a subject to get into. It is a simple subject. You can be hauled out for whatever you put on social media, whatever you might say in conversations, etc. Next question, if we have. Nonoy Espina and UJP, a question for everyone, anyone. Why do you think there's hardly any public outrage for attacks on journalists or the media? Have we distanced ourselves from our audiences? So it's a two-pronged question. Why is it that nobody seems to care when we are attacked? Yes, Camille, have we distanced ourselves from the audience? Go ahead, Camille.
Okay, I think the first question is that why do we think there's hardly any public outrage? I think the one reason why is it that we are painted as antagonists here. There's also again, this is within the subject of trust. We're painted as enemies of progress, that because of by virtue of doing our jobs, we are actually hindering what the government wants, the good that it wants for the people. And also, I think that's also the lack of media literacy and news literacy, appreciation for journalism, not just among the public, but also how they are being educated towards that. And then for the second question, have we distanced ourselves from the audiences in the context of these attacks? And yes, one sign of that is that there has been a diminishing of community newspapers, really local organizations that are covering the regions. We are already losing them. I'm not sure when we can recover from this, but that is really one sign that we are not anymore reaching the critical mass here.
Okay, thank you. Rafi and Mike, and then we will have to move on to the next question to give them a chance to feed us with more questions. Rafi, please.
I think the question is now is, do we still have the trust of the public? I think to some extent we still do. But to put that into perspective, it depends on the kind of stories we do. If, for example, it's just a police story or a simple story, I think people still trust us. Or maybe the problem is propaganda against the media is more prevalent now than before. And so I think the bigger question is whether the problem really is trust on the media, or maybe the problem is propaganda against the media is louder, more rabid and more prevalent. And I think it is, because attacks against the media has become more organized to some extent. It has become an operation, the aim of which, of course, is to silence us. And so I think people still trust us, but they get confused on certain issues because of the propaganda against the media.
Thank you. Propaganda. And somebody should tell where that propaganda is coming from and how it is possible to pursue such propaganda through the years and to the extent of it. And that takes a lot of courage as well, to be able to point out and to find the connections or to connect the dots. I had Mike's hand, right? Did I have Mike's hand? Yes.
Yes, I think this is a product of years and years of constant attacks against the media. And these are attacks that are organized, orchestrated, and well-funded, because you can see it from the materials that's been put out. You have Photoshop images, you have videos produced on YouTube that are attacking the credibility of the media. So I would think that this is well-funded, and we need to look into that. But also, this is the effect of chipping away the credibility of Philippine media. So we need to regain that social media space to be able to win this propaganda war. And I agree with Rafi that propaganda is drowning out the noise of legitimate news. So we need to retake that space.
Very good. And do we have one more? Okay, Shara, keep it brief at this point.
Okay. Well, they've already discussed the erosion of the trust in media. I think it's true that people have forgotten the value of journalists, the value of a free press to their everyday lives, and that's something that we need to remind them of. But secondly, I think it's because so many other people have died, and there has been a slow erosion of the value of life here in the Philippines. The people who have died have been condemned as deserving to die, and that doesn't just include the journalists, but the other people either wrongfully accused or just simply accused of participating in the drug trade.
Thank you. We have time for maybe 2 more questions from the audience. Can I have the next question, please? Rosemary De Castro. I have seen this discussion on Reddit about the resilience porn in PH in the Philippines. The post says that there is so much news featuring Filipinos trying to make ends meet amid this pandemic and are therefore resorting to earning money through these sites. Though inspiring, it instead further amplifies the culture of not demanding action from government and holding officials accountable, since we're banking on Filipinos' resilience. What is your take on this? Did we get the sense of that question? Can I have it flashed back again? Yes, Christian.
I think a big part of this problem has to do with the culture. Parang ano, at this point, we need to stop romanticizing resiliency or resilience, especially Filipinos. I mean, I agree. We have to start doing that in terms of demanding accountability from those in government, especially the elected officials. And media would play a big role in that. For example, here in the pandemic, I think a lot of the inadequacies coming from the national government are drowned out by the very efficient and I suppose well-funded propaganda machine by the government. And I think it's very important for us to keep reminding the people about that. It's not that we want the government's pandemic response to fail, definitely not. But we need to identify where the mistakes happened, and especially this concerns public health. So whenever there are things that we feel or we know would go against issues of public health and could actually lead to deaths, we have to call out government on that, and we need to correct them. I think this is not always happening because the medical experts in the government themselves are afraid, not just me, to correct the president himself, who had made a lot of bogus claims during this pandemic response.
Okay, thank you. Yes, indeed, resilience. Everybody says we'll survive because we're resilient, and this is just a little bit too much of a ballad to ourselves, I think. Camille, did you have your hand up? Camille?
Yes, yes, ma'am. Actually, just to repeat, somehow Christian's response, is this really resilience? Or actually resilience for me is more of a personal virtue, personal characteristic. But as a community, as a culture, is it resilience, or are we just trying to survive? That we are just trying to be resourceful because we have no other way to do so. The things that we find, we see, or we depict in the news as responses to these are market responses to structural weakness. For example, the existence of tricycles, or people really creating makeshift bangkas with flooding, and then the tricycles are because public transportation is terrible in the Philippines. So yeah, I think the media has to also do a better job in qualifying that.
Actually, some of your answers bring up the whole idea of meekness, because I think really Filipinos are meek, period. They will not complain about terrible traffic. They will not complain about so many things. Their expectations of what they should get from public officials and the response of government is just so minimal that if you give them a little bit, they say, at least nabigyan ako ng kaunti, and really, let's try to awaken. It's true. It is true. It is part of our cultural virtue na maamo ka, you're meek, all the other ways in which we describe this. And maybe there are stories that should show up, perhaps the need to shift to another kind of mode, especially in terms of evaluating government and how much government has done for us. Mike, I had your hand, yes?
I think this also goes into the issue of the editorial judgment of the newsroom. Is the newsroom more concerned about not causing alarm to the public in the face of the pandemic, or are you more concerned in holding officials accountable and asking them to do their jobs and looking at what they're actually doing? You can call out, for example, the president or IATF for what they're not doing. We can do that. But is that what's happening? Are we choosing to focus on the human stories of survival, also because that's easily understandable, and then that doesn't, earn the ire of government officials. So it's a balancing act, an editorial discretion on the part of the newsroom that they have to decide on.
Yeah, actually. I had a hand that, shall I call on you, Rafi? Did you want to continue or what? Yes.
Yes, coming off from what Mike just said, yes, resiliency is always a good story. It touches people's heart and it keeps our story relatable, which is basically our aim. But at some point, we really have to go above and beyond that storyline. Resilient stories are tried and tested and they are effective, but we can do better as journalists.
We move the narrative forward. Let us have the last question, please, and we may not have everyone answering. Gabby Castro, third-year student, St. Scholastica's College, Manila. My question can be answered by anyone. What is your opinion of the president's contradictory statements? Do you think it will affect the people's view on government and the media as sources of information? Have you all heard of the last Pulse Asia survey? What do you think? Usually when we have the physical audience, I basically say, what do you think? Can I have a raise? Can I have your hands raised? What do you think of the contradictory statements? Do you want to take this question, panel? Leon, Christian, go. Leon, please, and then Mike. Right. Leon, Christian.
Yeah, I think it's established. It's now a fact that the president does really make a lot of contradicting statements. And I just want to give credit to Philstar talaga, the Philstar social media team, for like trailing the blaze for us all in terms of calling out the contradicting statements of the president or any of his officials. But more than pointing out the contradiction of his statements, I think it's more important that we point out if what he's saying at one point or another is lawful or not. Kasi parang wag tayong maguluhan na. Kasi kung ginugulo niya tayo, wag tayong magpagulo. Let us stay focused on whether what he's saying is legal or not. Of course, what he says will still be policy, but we cannot just give up. We just have to continue pointing out if it's illegal or not. I mean, he's a lawyer. He's surrounded by lawyers. His daughter is a lawyer. So, umasa tayong sooner or later, he's gonna be bothered by the conscience of a lawyer, and maybe he'll magigising na lang siya na may mali sa ginagawa niya.
Okay, who was the other? Whose hand was it? Was it Mike and then Christian? Rafi. Oh, okay, fine. Go, Mike. Let's not waste time. Go ahead.
I actually envy some newspapers, news organizations in the United States when they actually document the many times that US President Trump lied. I wish we could do that here. But I guess our public is not as mature as US audiences are, because the moment we do that, we get branded as dilawan or enemies of the state. But it's important for the public to understand we need to point out the inconsistencies in the statements of the government, especially the president. For instance, downplaying the virus at first, and then later on saying that you need to address it with all the powers that are available to the government. So it's curious that I first saw clips comparing or exposing the inconsistencies of the president's statements on social media, not even on traditional media. So that's something that we have to keep up with.
Thank you. And who did I have? Did I have Christian and Rafi? And then I will have to close there, I think. Yeah, Christian?
Whether the errors or the contradictory statements coming from the presidents are actually resonating on the ground, that's an entirely different question. And we might be disheartened if we look at the results of the latest Pulse Asia survey. But as far as journalists are concerned, I think there's no other way to approach that but to provide more contextual reporting, more context. And I think, to be fair, yung Philstar.com, binanggit ni Lian, and even Rappler, they have been pretty consistent regarding that. They're providing timelines and identifying the contradictory statements coming from the president. And we need to do this more consistently as far as the industry is concerned, because there's no other way to deal with this, especially those words are coming from the president. Personally, I think some of us are giving too much credit to the president in terms of thinking that he might be such a sophisticated leader that there might be a lot of intention, very sophisticated intention behind certain statements that on their face appear to be quite bogus. But I think that's just the way it is on many occasions. He comes up with a lot of crazy ideas and pronouncements, and they are being used for many different purposes as far as the government is concerned. And as media, I think we have no other way but to provide context there and to correct the president. I wouldn't pass a moral judgment on him and say that he's lying. I would just say that he's not telling the truth on many occasions.
Okay, that what was uttered does not reflect the truth. And Rafi for the final
Yeah.
response.
Yeah, I think that is a classic, a populist pattern. Whatever is popular, that is where the narrative is led. And then I agree with Leah that we just have to focus. We have to keep our eye on the ball. And that's, I think, is the most important job journalists nowadays have to take.
Keeping the eye on the target. And we must admit that we did this a little bit late because we believed in giving 6 months honeymoon when we let the new president, having been elected by Filipinos, that he should be given this 6 months. In the 6 months, the entire political narrative changed. And we have been at a loss in terms of trying to do catch up. And this is why I think this year, this program speaks really to that audience that I cannot see. And hopefully that somewhere, someone will catch this ball as well, because we are not the only ones that should be carrying the burden of responsibility for what is happening in our democracy. Thank you so much for the panel. We are taking a 5-minute break, which is usually what we do for the physical program, and we need to do as well, even though we are on digital, is for you to be able to stretch your legs and attend to whatever urgent other tasks. In 5 minutes, please return promptly so we can begin the last part of the program. Thank you. Start. Welcome back. Is everyone back? Welcome back, honored guests, faculty and students, friends, ladies and gentlemen. And I am happy to start the second part of our program, Simple Ceremonies of Recognition, keeping the second part of the program short and sweet as we approach the hour of lunch, which we usually serve as the closure of the program. But it does give me a little bit of a chance to let everybody know about the work of CMFR, which I hope you will not begrudge me. It is now on its 31st year in the field of media development, having broken new ground when it established 3 programs, placing media ethics and responsibility at the heart of journalistic practice through the first Philippine Journalism Review and a journalism review or media monitor, protecting press freedom through databases, 2 databases. One, a journalist killings, which has cases from 1986, and a database on other attacks and threats against the press and media members. CMFR sends out alerts to its international partners, the International Freedom of Expression Exchange, or IFEX, based in Toronto, Canada, and to the Paris-based Reporters Sans Frontières, who we have been working with for several decades now. Today's program celebrates the work of outstanding journalists, recognizing best works and practices as a way of promoting quality journalism, excellence, if you will, through the Jaime V. Ongpin Journalism Seminar. This program serves as a living memorial to the role of a non-journalist. Jaime Ongpin was a leading figure in the business community who dared to confront the establishment captured by the regime. He led the support for Veritas News Weekly from 1983 to 1986. He felt it was time to challenge the monopoly of news by the crony press, the newspapers controlled by the friends and family and members of Mr. Marcos. Happily, in a period of 3 years, our readership was nationwide, and Veritas, together with a clutch of other alternative newspapers, did help to galvanize the political will of Filipinos all over the country to question the legitimacy of the regime. Jimmy was highly esteemed in the field of business and finance and served as Secretary of Finance in the government of President Corazon Aquino. A moment to remember Jaime V. Ongpin. May music ba to? Where are we? I think it is important to recall his special understanding of the power of the press and the role that journalists can play to bring about change. He saw his responsibility more than just to make sure that we could pay our bills and salaries. He wrote his reactions to reports and stories and sent back notes to the staff. Indeed, the quality of the press does not lie only in the capacity of those working in the press. The public, those not of the press, have as much responsibility to support press freedom when attacked and imperiled, when struck down and unable to stand up to the power of the state. It suggests that every citizen in a democracy cannot take for granted the process of growing a strong and quality press. It calls not just for the work of publishers and editors and reporters, it also requires an audience and a public that commits to its growth, providing active feedback, questioning and complaining, and otherwise engaged as a consumer of news. This Jimmy did for those of us working at Veritas News Weekly from 1983 to 1988. But I remember that he saw Veritas as only one of the larger community of journalists who had made the stand to provide alternative news channels for the Filipinos at the time. When he had information about some developments, he thought it important to share with others, not just Veritas, not following the command of keeping it a scoop for the paper of which we were a part. I recall a meeting when he briefed not just the editors of Veritas, but some developments, but also Mr. and Ms., then under Ege Apostol, and then Business Day, then under Raul Locsin, who would later be named, both of them named Ramon Magsaysay laureate, wanting the alternative press to consolidate and to carry the news for greater impact. These remarks of circumstance give me the chance to share with those who are not in the media the current challenges confronting the media community. We heard our panel speak about it from their own personal experience. Because of the low tolerance of criticism that has been exhibited by the president, he had made clear he does not like the media unless they are nice to him. Clearly, then, there would be news organizations would find themselves in direct collision of the state and its powers. And everyone knows the president did announce he would go after the Philippine Daily Inquirer, Rappler, and ABS-CBN, the three organizations which had sustained account of the killings in connection with the government's war on drugs. The cyber libel conviction of Maria Ressa is a case for lawyers, but also for anyone who would appreciate the term public figure, and how anyone who has close access to a person in the news, someone so very important as a Chief Justice, going through an impeachment cannot claim to be so private person. Also, as the case has highlighted the need to decriminalize libel, to begin to appreciate that defamation in the course of investigating wrongdoing in high places should be definitely recognized and fall under protected speech. Apart from these points, the conviction of Maria Ressa, the filing of 9 cases against her, indicates how the relationship of media and government has radically changed since 1986 and now recalls more the period of martial law. The impact of the closure of ABS-CBN, the ramifications of which may lie in the future still for other organizations to deal with. But the failure of the franchise is felt most in the communities where ABS-CBN was the only channel which afforded them free TV. At the same time, it has sent a message to one and all that media owners and journalists they employ that it can happen to any news organization that displeases the man in charge. The experience of ABS-CBN in the hands of the Committee on Public Utilities shows the need to create a non-political body that will assign media franchises. Everywhere in the world, people look at us and say, they're the ones that give you the franchise for media. But in this country, whatever body must be able to prove how can government body really remain independent for long. These 2 policy points reflect the lack of maturity in our political institutions and our leadership of all the different sectors. Given the liberal bent of the Constitution, our politicians have been unwilling to decriminalize libel and to free franchise for media from politics. On the issue of freedom of information, we are better off at this time without a law, given that any law coming out of Congress will mean more definite restrictions. The Constitution has declared access to information as a right, and a Supreme Court ruling has already favored petitioners, describing the right as self-executory. Unfortunately, the president's animosity toward the critical press was a virus that spread very quickly in government. The quick dismissal of questions, the difficulty to get interviews, the stonewalling on requests for information, including silence, which are all public documents. Not to speak of the increased reports among journalists and media practitioners, especially those working in the provinces or what we call the community press, from all kinds of other attacks and threats, including the 18 journalists who were killed in the line of duty, and all those who have suffered physical assaults, arrest and detention, troll attacks, whose houses have been strafed with 6 slay attempts. We share this with you because you are stakeholders. The pandemic has, of course, prevented public rallies to form on any of these issues. But what is to stop you from raising your voice to be heard as a Filipino who desires a press however imperfect, to be free. Given this gloom, it is my pleasure then to be able to present journalists who have moved the line, probed the limits, risking job and more at times to provide news without fear or favor. All 6 of the panelists will receive a certificate of recognition from the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility. We recognize each of the panelists for the outstanding coverage that has helped Filipinos understand the complex issues that confront them as citizens, enlarging the role of the free press as a pillar of democracy in the Philippines, and for participating as a panelist in the 2020 Jaime V. Ongpin Journalism Seminar. They also receive a modest cash gift of 20,000 pesos as a small way to recognize the quality of their work during the years. And in some cases, it is a body of work that we recognize. This public event presents them as role models in the field of journalism, in the different media in where they work, in print, TV, and online news. So we thank you for joining us in the effort to cheer the best and the brightest among our media members. We hope that this recognition encourages them to keep up the good work, despite the odds and the challenges raised in certain quarters of our political community, including some of our colleagues in the media. There is something about challenge, confusion, and crisis that sometimes brings out the best in journalistic practice. Our 6 panelists are exemplars of press practice that provides the public with news that has gone through a process of fact-checking and verification, and more important, they work on news that matter. At this time, I would like to ask Ambassador of Canada, Peter MacArthur, to the podium or to his post to make a presentation. Huh? The ambassador, where is he? I'm sorry. We are somewhat delayed here, and we are waiting for the ambassador to get back to the studio. Apologies. Yes, we're sorry for that delay. We are going to turn the program a bit and move on to what would have been the final part until we can check with the ambassadors to what we shall do when he comes in to make his very important presentation, actually. We wish to announce there are two, right? The Marshall McLuhan Fellowship, which is presented by the ambassador. And then CMFR also presents an award for distinction in journalism for 2020. And this, the same jurors that selected the panel decided that this would be received by Miss Camille Diola, and with it, an additional check for 30,000 pesos. And we have recognized her for her resolve to seek the higher ground for 24/7 use so it can deepen the public understanding of the meaning of events and developments in time of crisis and uncertainty, for reinforcing the journalistic principle of going beyond the surface of news online, supplying the important context, analysis, and interpretation of official statements and quotes from government officials and spokespersons, for the integrity of her editorial leadership of philstar.com and the innovative spirit that has explored the ways of presenting news on cyberspace so that citizens can make better decisions about the issues that confront the national community. The Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility presents its 2019-2020 Award of Distinction to Camille Diola.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm very fortunate to be working with a team that's just, I don't know, I'm beyond words actually by now, but without really having produced a single story all year, I think this is testament to the work that the whole team has done. And we are, I'm inspired every day to check in, to go to work because also of their passion and their dedication and their concern for our audience. Thank you so much. This is a great honor for us.
Thank you for being there, Camille, and for pioneering in all the kinds of ways that you do your work. We celebrate your role in the press. And now I wonder if we might already have the ambassador. All right, we are still waiting. So maybe I can, let's do the recognition. We usually want to present the members of the Board of Trustees of the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility. They are all involved in the media, or some of them most of them are involved in the media one way or the other. But they now have to be a little bit more involved, hopefully, all of them, who provide oversight over the work of CMFR and making sure we are keeping good financial accounts. It is a relief to be able to call on any one of them to pitch in with editing as well as other issues important to the existence of CMFR. They are Tina Monzon Palma, whom everybody knows from ANC. We have Luis Teodoro, also from CMFR and the University of the Philippines. We have Vergel Santos, who writes a column for Rappler, as well as is often a guest on television, making trouble for his hosts sometimes. And then we have Francis Estrada, who is a leading figure in the promotion of corporate directors as well as part of the community that looks at the different issues of business and finance and how these intersect with the political questions of our day. And these are the men and women that every now and then we have to thank, we have to make sure that they are there for us, and that we hope that we will be able to sustain the work of CMFR through the years and into the future. Thank you so much, everyone. We are still waiting for Put me back on. Hi. And now we have the ambassador. I would like to ask Ambassador Peter MacArthur to the podium to make a presentation. Welcome, Ambassador
Thank you.
MacArthur.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. A bit of a technical issue here. I was in the backyard of StreamYard, shall we say. Thank you, Executive Director Melinda. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. As the new Canadian ambassador here in the Philippines since February, I am very happy to be able to be here at the end of your seminar, which I really enjoyed this morning, to announce the recipient of the Marshall McLuhan Fellowship for 2020. Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour. En tant que nouvel ambassadeur du Canada aux Philippines, je suis très heureux d'être ici pour la remise de la bourse Marshall McLuhan de 2020. As you know, the Embassy of Canada in the Philippines has been honored to be respecting the memory of the Canadian media guru Marshall McLuhan, and now for over 2 decades now. In fact, next year will be a quarter of a century. The medium is definitely the message, and we do live in a global village, as this pandemic is very much revealing. I want to, at this stage, before moving forward, thank my embassy colleagues Warren Mucci and Carlo Figueroa for their ongoing efforts to maintain this important tradition for Canada in the Philippines with our great partners at the CMFR. As we were reminded this morning in this excellent seminar we've just heard and learned from, this past year has been a momentous one for media in the Philippines. Last December, actually, not that long ago, but after many years, we saw the conviction of 28 suspects for the murder of 57 people in the Magallanes Indanao massacre. And this included, of course, 32 media workers who sadly perished. Canada welcomed that decision, as did others, a resolution to a grisly attack on democratic values held by Filipinos and Canadians and many others around the world. The past few months have seen journalists convicted criminally for cyber libel and the non-renewal of a legislative broadcast franchise. Worryingly, harassment and violent attacks against media professionals continued, including 2 journalistic colleagues who were killed. Canada joins with others in firmly believing that for democracy to truly flourish, freedom of the press must be respected. My government remains very concerned with the threats, risks, and violence against courageous journalists who are facing these threats when they do their vital work. The media should not have to fear retribution for being truthful in pursuing and reporting their stories. Hand in hand with the freedom to do this important work, of course, comes the responsibility for media organizations and journalists to be objective, accurate, and consistent in the quality of their craft. Likewise, a clear and predictable regulatory environment is needed for all businesses to function optimally for the public good, and not only media outlets. And this is what I hear from business people, both foreign and domestic. Predictability in business, so important for jobs, prosperity, for growth. The unprecedented challenge brought by the COVID-19 pandemic has increased the difficulty for media to provide unbiased, timely, and actionable information about the threat posed by this terrible virus and the means to protect one's health and that of the community and of the economy. Next month, beginning in November, Canada will join with Botswana in co-hosting the 2nd Global Conference for Media Freedom, where one of the topics will be the effect of COVID-19 on media freedom. I have just observed with great interest this excellent thought-provoking seminar discussion and took note of many of the views solicited by the seminar's excellent leadership, the CMFR's Executive Director, Melinda. And I want to commend panel members Mike, Camille, Leanne, and Christian for their informed answers to some really good questions. Turning now to the Marshall McLuhan Fellowship, I am very pleased to be part of this recognition celebration because I have to say in my early years, I admit, I was the editor of the college newspaper and thought at one stage in the future I myself might become a journalist. Instead, I'm a diplomat, but I'm a huge consumer and beneficiary of the excellent journalistic work across a range of news sources and platforms. And I really enjoy the vibrant media of the Philippines. It is a noble calling, being a journalist, a professional commitment that journalists watching today, but also students of journalism at universities and colleges across the country are aspiring to. So today we recognize the frontline role of journalists and media workers to bring to light news that otherwise may not be reported, to expose irregularities, to tell the truth with facts and evidence, and to further accountability. The embassy first partnered with the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility here in the Philippines to launch the Marshall McLuhan Fellowship in 1997, and so this year is year 24. I want to point out that we really depend upon and value very much the support of Sun Life of Canada, which continues in its 14th year as the primary sponsor of the Marshall McLuhan Fellows Travel to Canada. Indeed, I wanted to point out that Sun Life of Canada, based in Toronto, was the first insurance company in the Philippines, founded this year, 125 years ago. And we are really truly grateful to this major employer of Filipinos right across the archipelago and to our partners at CMFR. This year we have, of course, had to make changes in our program because of the pandemic, including this very event online virtually. But we are planning for the Marshall McLuhan Fellow to undertake a later speaking tour to Canada in March in hopes that travel will be more possible in future. The fellow, as usual, will meet with media counterparts across my country, members of the Canadian government, and civil society. Deciding between the excellent panelists for this fellowship was indeed a great challenge for us. All of them uphold the best traditions of media responsibility, consistency in providing the public with outstanding coverage of the most pressing news of the day, knowledge of a wide range of issues, deftness in adapting to the changing platforms of the industry, this digital revolution we're all living through, which has really sped up, accelerated through the pandemic, and a desire to mold the next generation of media professionals. And I'm really pleased that so many young Filipinos who aspire to a journalistic career are online with us today. And I encourage you to study hard, even online, and enter the whole world of media, so important to democracy and to accountability. Ultimately, though, one of these panelists must be chosen, and this year's McLuhan Fellowship goes to a journalist whose passion for the craft transcends new platforms and whose proficient mastery to discover and explain the facts restricts the space for disinformation to thrive. Very, very important. So, drum roll, please. I am honored to virtually present this year's Marshall McLuhan Fellowship to Christian Ezegara. Congratulations, Christian, félicitations, very well deserved. And I really enjoyed your commentary during the panel just now. Congratulations from Canada and from the Marshall McLuhan Foundation.
Thank you very much, sir, for this award. Definitely a great honor. But I'd also like to share this to my fellow with my fellow panelists whose works I truly admire, their individual work, because I've been seeing their work across platforms as well, and I'd also like to personally recognize not just their efforts, but for example, the efforts of many other journalists out there who continue to keep fighting despite the odds that the industry and the profession are facing today. So I think they should be recognized as well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador MacArthur. And thank you and congratulations, Christian. We will still call on you to be part of the panel, even though you have already received both the award and distinction and the Marshall McLuhan Fellow. And so congratulations to Camille, to Christian, and to all our panelists, Lian, Rafi, Shara, Mike, Rafi, I did already say. And I want to have our audience out there know that every time we put the panel together, there are many, many considerations. And this year we have just been so proud to be able to select these and congratulate these journalists who have really drawn the line and shown everyone what can be done, even in the most difficult circumstances. So congratulations, Christian. Congratulations, Camille. And now I would like to call on Ms. Lisa Ongpin Periquet for her closing remarks.
Thank you, Melinda. A very good morning to all of you. I am Lisa Ongpin Periquet, and I'm here to address you today as the representative of my family. I'm the eldest daughter of Jaime V. Ongpin. Thank you, Melinda, for taking more than a moment to remember my father and what he believed in. My mother, Maribel, used to give the closing message for the JVO journalism seminar each year, and she has now assigned me this task. It's quite a job to attempt to fill her shoes, which I assure you I won't try to do. However, I can at least do as she has always done, which is to speak from the heart. I find it amazing that the JVO Journalism Seminar has been around for 30 years already, 31 to be exact. It has always been the event that each year crystallizes the results of the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility's flagship programs, which monitor the media, promote media ethics, press freedom, and excellence in the practice of journalism. The seminar has always been a yearly venue that fostered the discussion and reflection on the role of media in our society. Ultimately, it has served as a support and recognition of the best in Philippine journalism, and also of the important contribution journalists make to our world today. All this has been accomplished in the face of the winds of turbulent change around us, which recently included the shocking takedown of a media giant, the long-term effects of which will surely continue to be discussed in future seminars. So, we need to continue to be around to offer this space for the distillation and discussion of such ideas. I think the participation and interaction of journalism students with media practitioners is particularly essential to this effort. I would like to congratulate the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility, specifically Melinda De Jesus and her team, for their perseverance and intrepid survival in the face of many challenges, financial, political, logistical, such as the move to the digital space this year. Even the passing of time is a challenge, as they constantly endeavor to improve and burnish the craft of journalism in the I would also like to thank the Embassy of Canada and Sun Life of Canada for its support of this quietly sustained, under the radar yet important effort by endowing the Marshall McLuhan Fellowship since 1997. Thank you very much too for staying the course. Finally, to the panelist awardees, congratulations and a big thank you to all of you for your bravery and determination in persisting with your profession, despite the many challenges you mentioned today, which are both external and internal. I hope very much that this humble recognition can inspire you to always do your best in your craft as journalists in this country of ours, where now, more than ever, we need you to bring to us the facts about the things that matter in our society today. The Dalai Lama once told his oppressed Tibetan people, "The power of truth never declines. Force and violence may be effective in the short term, but in the long run, it's truth that prevails." I believe in this and hope that this bit of food for thought can help inform and inspire your work, especially during the challenging times of today and surely the future too. Thank you very much again, and congratulations to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you on behalf of the board of the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility. Let me also acknowledge the hard work of the CMFR staff, Lara for logistics and coordination, Carol for keeping tab of our expenses, Penzer for keeping tab of the digitalization process, Geraldine for your question moderation, and Anka and Rosanna, who in all the different ways continue to do the work that keeps CMFR going. Thank you. And lastly, I would like to acknowledge the support of the Washington-based National Endowment of Democracy and the continuing cooperation with the Ateneo de Manila University and other contributions from some donors that have helped us through the years to sustain this program. I hope you have found it worth the time that you have sat through. I apologize for the technical glitches, but this is now the new normal and we must smile through it. Thank you very much to the Embassy of Canada and to the Ambassador, and most of all to the panelists. I hope that we shall see each other in more fortunate times. Goodbye, and thank you for listening.